Zero clearance insert plates are one of those upgrades that everyone should do to their table saws. Now there are commercially available plates that you can purchase for this purpose, but frankly I find that making my own out of various materials is about the best solution, and let's explain why. Now when comparing to a stock throat plate, the stock throat plates are generally made out of metal, oftentimes just die cast. They have a large opening in them, and that's to accommodate the tilt of the blade. So you really can't get rid of your standard throat plates whenever you're doing bevel cutting operations. They'll also have this extra notch at the back. That's to accommodate your stock blade guard. They'll have a finger hole so that you can lift the throat plate out very conveniently. Near the back edge, generally they have a small pin of some sort that serves as a keeper. It doesn't allow the back end of the plate to lift up. Now when I mentioned that there are commercially available zero clearance plates, they're blanks, oftentimes made out of various forms of plastic and so forth. This particular one, very, very flimsy. I didn't like this at all, even though it's got a large opening in it, it was still flimsy without the cuts in it. But as you feed stock over, you can see how much it springs and bounces. So as you're doing dado cuts or even ripping operations on narrow stock, if it's only supported by this, you can see it bends down. Not a real good solution. Over the years I've been making my own throat plates out of various materials. In recent years I've been using MDO, medium density overlay material. This is the stuff you see that fella on TV use all the time for various pieces of furniture that he's going to paint. It has that resin impregnated paper over plywood. Now I thought this was going to be a really good solution, but as it turns out, this surface doesn't take well to abrasion. Now as we're cutting, you can imagine the chips coming down at this front end of the blade and being brought down inside the saw. Well, that area there is just abraded away terribly. So it didn't really work out as one of the best possible solutions. So I'm going to try a couple different types of material and see how those perform over the years. But in any case, when making the zero clearance insert plate, there's a couple of things that we really have to pay attention to. Now one, we'll have to make it out of 1/2 inch thick stock. With just 1/2 inch thick material, it's going to sit too low and not be flush with your table surface. So you'll need to provide a means of jack screws to raise and lower the zero clearance insert plate. You'll need to add some form of anti-rotation or anti-lift device. This is just a simple block of wood that is glued in and hooks underneath the back edge of the opening, and that prevents it from lifting. Now in order for a zero clearance insert plate to actually function properly, it has to fit in this opening tightly. If it's allowed to slop around in there, like so, it's not going to be a zero clearance. In other words, if this is allowed to float around in here, that saw blade is going to continually make this slot wider and wider, and then that takes away its effectiveness. So we have to, when we make our own, come up with a way so that the zero clearance insert plate that we make fits into that opening and stays snug. You don't want it to be slopping around in there. And there's a couple of different ways we can go about that, but we'll try to show you one of the simplest ways that minimizes the necessity to perfectly machine this shape. Here are some of the materials that you can use to make these zero clearance insert plates out of. This happens to be 1/2 inch birch plywood, not the expensive variety, just the type that you can pick up at your local home center. Works out fairly well. 1/2 inch MDF, probably the most economical choice, and it works very easily. You can machine it quite easily and so forth, so it's a good choice. I'm going to be trying a phenolic product. This is a fiberglass covered Baltic birch type plywood. It's very stable, has this tough surface on it that I'm hoping will be much more abrasive resistance. It's also very slippery, so as you're feeding stock over it, it'll have a tendency to slide across as opposed to kind of stick as you're feeding across bare wood. So this is the material I'll be using this time around, and I'm hoping that it's going to perform very well. Now we'll get started making the zero clearance insert plate by ripping and cross-cutting some strips I'll be rough cutting my blanks out in 1/8 inch oversize, both in width and length. Now we're ready to start making our throat plates to the proper shape. And we're going to use the factory throat plate as a template to route the shape on our zero clearance insert plates. To route that, I'm using a 1/2 inch diameter, white side, pattern following bit. And that'll make this operation very fast, very easy, and very accurate. Now I've got double face tape applied to the stock zero clearance insert plate, and what I'll do is I'll just press that down on my blank and then secure them together. And of course you want to hold good pressure on here for about 10-15 seconds to make sure that the two pieces are bonded together nicely. Now we'll just raise up our bit until the bearing just clears our material that we're cutting. And if you're lucky, the bearing's small enough to go right underneath the anti-rotation or anti-lift pin. And I think we're in good shape there. And then it's just a matter of very carefully guiding the work around the router bit, following along on our master template. And after just a few moments at the router table, you can see we've got an exact match of our master template. Now before we move on, I'd like to point out something. You may have noticed that I used my dado insert for my template master. And the reason for that was it doesn't have that extra cutout in the back for the blade guard, because you can't use the stock blade guard with a dado or molding head cutter. If you've only got the standard throat plate, if you place a piece of tape over that opening, that will help prevent the router bit from diving in at that cutout area. Now you'll still end up with a little dent at that point on your throat insert plate. Now if you just take and make one, fill that area with a little bit of wood filler and then sand the curve on it. Then you can use that one for your master to make all the rest of them. Now I will be keeping one of these for my master template, so when I make zero clearance insert plates in the future, I've got a handy master. To prevent the throat plate from lifting up on the back side, we need to incorporate some form of an anti-lift device. Now on the stock units, as you can see here, they've just cast on a small button. It's not very big. It sticks out about 1/8 of an inch. It's about 1/8 of an inch in diameter. Now of course we can't cast anything on ours, but what we can use is a very simple roll pin or a spring pin. The size that I've got here is 1/8 inch diameter, 3/4 of an inch long, and you can pick these up in the hardware stores. Now we do have to make sure that when we drill the hole that it's far enough down towards the bottom surface so that the pin can fit underneath the lip in the back of our opening on the table saw. And of course we want to make sure we drill the hole deep enough so that the pin goes down far enough where it doesn't stick out too far and bind up underneath the table saw. To drill that hole, all I needed was an 1/8 inch drill in my drill press. I lowered the table down and clamped a vise on to hold my workpiece. Very carefully, I of course fed in, making sure that the drill bit didn't wander around too much. Now the nice part about a roll pin or a spring pin, it's actually larger in this case than 1/8 of an inch. So after drilling the hole, we can just tap it in and it should stay in securely. If it doesn't, you can of course use epoxy to help hold it in place. And that works fine. It won't lift up on us. So now we've got the anti-lift up taken care of. Now if you're used to working with sloppy fitting zero clearance insert plates, you're probably used to just pushing down at the back, lifting up the front and removing it. But as I mentioned before, you really don't want your throat plate to be sloppy in that fit. And we'll address that in a moment. But you'll notice on the stock throat plate that they provide a finger hole to lift it out. So we'll do the same. Now you can of course position that just about anywhere where the blade isn't going to be. I'm going to place mine about 1 inch up from my end and centrally located. And I'll use a 1-inch Forstner bit just to bore that hole. Well, that works out real good. We got a nice finger pull. Now let's address the issue of the slop. To provide adjustment to take up that slop, what we're going to be using is a small 1/4-20 by 1/2 inch long nylon set screw. And as you can see, it's a slotted type. Of course, you can get them in hex head and so forth, but this type just is real handy. You can pick these up at industrial supply houses and some hardware stores. Now what we'll need to do is install 3 of them, 2 on one edge and then one at the end where our finger pull is going to be located. And that'll give us 3-point adjustment to take up all that slop. Now where we position them is a little bit critical, but nothing where you got to get all excited. All we want to do is make sure that they're centrally located relative to the thickness of our stock. And then where we position them along its length and on the end, we just want to make sure that we're not going to put them where we have to install our jack screws, which we'll later drill holes for adjusting the height of our zero clearance throat plate. So all I did was just find a place, made some layout marks, and went over to the drill press and started drilling the holes. Now the holes that we have to drill for a 1/4-20 tap are a number 7 drill. If you don't have a number 7, you can use a 13/64. This is only wood, so we don't have to be absolutely perfect with our tap drill size. Now using a 1/4-20 tap in my tap holder, just thread the tap in. It's not like tapping metal where we gotta go in a 1/4 turn and back up to break the chips. Just run the tap straight in. Of course, you want to drill and tap your holes deep enough to fully accommodate the length of that nylon set screw. And now we can install the 3 nylon set screws, and of course you can use metal if you can't find the nylon ones. We'll adjust them so that we get a nice snug fit. No slop, no rattle. Now we can address the issue of how deep our throat plate rests relative to the table surface. And that will just simply require 4 jack screws, just as they do with the factory units. The factory throat plate has 4 set screws to allow you to adjust the height of it. And they just come through the back side and they're drilled and tapped. Now we really don't need that elaborate of a setup for a zero clearance insert plate. All we're going to do is on our back side drill 4 holes in the same location and use basic wood screws. Now of course if you have your factory throat plate, we could use that for a drilling template. All we need to do is use double-faced tape and tack it onto the zero clearance insert plate that we're making right now. And of course you'd have to remove the jack screws. I'm just going to use one of the other ones that I've made previously and use that for my drilling template. And I'll just drill with a 3/32 inch drill bit using double-faced tape to hold my template to my zero clearance insert plate. Now before we install our jack screws, we've got one very critical step to do next. And it has to do with when we're working with 10-inch diameter saw blades. Now if we were to just try and take our zero clearance insert, you'll notice that it won't drop down in there. The diameter of the blade's too high, the table saw won't go down low enough for our zero clearance insert plate to fit in there. Now I learned a trick from Paul Anthony while I was filming another story for a different company. And I think it's just a great idea and a great trick for getting your first cut into your zero clearance insert plate. Now you can use your stock throat insert plate for this, or you can use an older, worn out zero clearance insert plate. Either way, what you want is something that's already got a slot in it. Now if you're using your stock throat plate, back off your screws so that the insert will fit down as far as it'll go inside the opening. Now in my case, I'm using this old zero clearance insert plate, and I've taken out my jack screws to allow it to drop all the way down, and it sits down in there about 3/16 of an inch. That allows me to position my new zero clearance insert plate on top of the old one, and it's still not hitting the saw blade. And then what I'll do, I'll carefully bring it into alignment along the left edge and back edge, because my 2 or 3 jack screws, 2 are here and 1 is at this end, and I'm always driving it towards this corner. So I'll pull it back into that corner, and then using one of these toggle clamps that you can pick up at the various woodworking stores, I'll clamp this down and raise the saw blade up. Now if you find that one clamp doesn't seem to hold it securely, there's nothing wrong with putting 2 clamps on. Now if you don't have these fancy toggle clamps, you can also clamp on a very long board at the front and back of the saw directly over your throat plate. Clamp it down securely at the front and back of the saw, and that will hold our zero clearance insert plate in position while we raise the saw blade. Now we can go ahead and install the jack screws on the bottom surface and adjust it for flatness. Then some number 6 by 3/8 or possibly even 1/2 inch long sheet metal screws will serve as our jack screws. Then using a nice straight edge, we'll continue to adjust those screws until we get our throat plate to sit flush with our table's surface. Now at this point I've got everything fitting up snug and flat. Now before I turn on the saw for the first time with our zero clearance insert plate all the way down, what I've done is put it in and then reached in underneath the saw with it unplugged and then rotated the pulleys around to see if there was any binding or anything. It seemed to rotate fine, but as one extra precaution, what I like to do is bring my fence over on top of the zero clearance insert plate. Now the blade will come up right here next to the fence, but the fence will hold it down in case there is any additional binding. And of course you could use those toggle clamps as well. So this is one last time. We'll start up the blade, raise it up to its full height, and drop it back down. And that's the last step for our zero clearance insert plate. We've got it installed, we've got it flat, set at the right height, adjusted so there isn't any slop. Now it's also a good idea to make zero clearance insert plates for all of your different saw blades. Here we've got our thin curved blade and a matching insert, our standard curved blade and a matching insert, and don't forget about your dado blades. You can greatly improve their cutting performance with a zero clearance insert. And of course, because dado blades cut at various widths, I like to make up zero clearance insert plates for the various widths that I use most frequently: 3/4 inch, 1/2 inch, and 1/4 inch. Now when making up your zero clearance insert plates, of course the important factors are that you want it to fit snug in the opening. You don't want it to slide around in there. If it's allowed to slide side to side, that can create binding between the zero clearance insert plate and the saw blade, and that could cause it to throw out. I like to use these adjustable set screws. Nylon work very well because they are compressible and they allow you to adjust that width or that fit very precisely, taking up that slop. Now of course you can take the time to try and machine these to fit perfectly in that metal opening. However, keep in mind, this is a metal saw top, this is a wood product. This will come and go with changes in humidity. So that's why I like that adjustability. Make sure that you provide some form of adjustment to adjust its height so that it sits flat in that opening and it's flush with the top of your table saw's surface. Basic sheet metal screws work out very well for that. At the back end, provide some form of anti-lift-up device that hooks under the back edge of that opening so that the back end can't lift up. And of course, you can use the roll pin as we described, or create a little counter bore and glue in a tab of wood that will hook up underneath that area. Now as these insert plates wear out or get plenty of use, sooner or later they're going to start wearing out in that opening area. Now as it wears out like this one did, and I really should have replaced this a long time ago, if my saw blade is in this area where the cut is, I'm going to get tear out in this area. So by having a nice tight slot against the edges of the saw blade, you'll always end up with a real nice clean cut. As it wears out like this, it's time to replace your zero clearance insert plate. Many of our viewers have been asking me via email and phone calls what this green plastic device is on my zero clearance insert plate. What this is a splitter. It's made by Microjig, and they sell a kit that allows you to install this splitter on your zero clearance insert plates. Now we won't go into that information at this point, but I would recommend that you check out our product demo section in this issue of the magazine. We'll be going over their standard curve splitter as a demonstration in this issue. In a future issue, we'll be looking at their thin curve version as well. So that wraps up this discussion on zero clearance insert plates, how to construct them, some pointers along the way on how to install them, adjust them, and make them fit up properly. Hope you enjoyed this story. I'm Chris DeHut for Woodworking at Home.